Hello all, and welcome to the first of 3 lectures on today's topic of slavery and free persons. In this lecture, we're going to talk about the institution of slavery in Rome. And before we begin, I want to start with a note on terminology. Instead of slave, which implies agency on the part of the person, I will be using enslaved individual to reflect the reality that these people did not choose to be enslaved. The same goes with master. I will be using enslaver instead to emphasize the power dynamic. Roman law defines slavery as thus, from Harvey number 109. Servitude is an institution of universal law in which, against nature, a person is subjected to the ownership of another person. The name servus, slave, is derived from the practice of triumphant generals to sell at auction prisoners of war. To do this, they would preserve, servare, rather than kill them. Justinian, in his mammoth compendium of Roman law, notes the distinction between human and slave as being one of the most basic when determining social status. Indeed, differentiation based on birth, wealth, and citizenship were only open to those who were free. As property, slaves had little to no status under Roman law. Slaves in the ancient world could come from a variety of sources. Prisoners of war were enslaved and sold at auction. Exposed children were often picked up by slave traders, trained, and then sold. Even citizens could become a slave due to the inability to repay debts. Either they would sell themselves into slavery to the person they owed money to, or would sell one of their family members to get the money to pay off the debt. Or they could become enslaved due to criminal punishment, but only for the lower classes. In addition, another source of enslaved people in Rome, which were seen as ideal enslaved people, were Verni, or the children of enslaved people. These were seen as ideal because they only ever knew enslavement and would not have freedom, the memory of freedom, to want to be free. The main takeaway from this list is also the most important. There was absolutely no correlation between race and slavery. Slaves were any and all races, cultures, ages, and genders. This is a text not from your textbook, but worth mentioning. It is a historical account of a town being captured, ransomed, and then anyone who couldn't pay the ransom being sold into slavery. I've mentioned this before. The survivors fled to the heart of the city and sent ambassadors to the consuls to ask that their lives be spared. They agreed that those people who paid 2 minae each would go free. Then the Romans took possession of the city. 14,000 people found the money and met the terms of the agreement and were released. The rest, 13,000 in number, were sold by the Romans as booty along with the other loot. The large number of people who were enslaved in the previous passage alone is cause to ask exactly how many enslaved people there were in Rome. In recent years, the number of slaves in the Roman Empire and the proportion of enslaved people in the empire's population has been a subject of intense debate. Historians of ancient Rome lack the sources available to modern historians, so these numbers must rely on careful estimates and demographic models. The historian Walter Scheidel estimates that enslaved people made up 10% of the empire's population, 6 million out of a population of some 60 million, but also gives the caveat that this is the lower limit. But we also need to take time and place into account. Scheidel's numbers are based on the empire, when Rome was very large and citizenship had spread to all the provinces. Rome and the Republic is much different. By the 1st century BCE, in Roman Italy, the heartland of the empire, enslaved people numbered 1 to 1.5 million out of a population of 5 to 6 million, or about 20 to 30%. In fact, there were so many enslaved individuals in Rome that measures to identify them by clothing were always vetoed, as the elite classes worried that enslaved people would see exactly how many they were, how outnumbered the free individuals were, and form alliances to revolt against their masters. So now the question remains, was Rome a society with slaves or a slave society? There are some big differentiations between these two definitions. In this video, although by an American Civil War historian, the speaker speaks of this theory and describes the difference.
One of the great theoretical tools we have in understanding slavery is this distinction between societies with slaves and slave societies. And what generally we mean by a society with slaves, a society in which slavery exists, but slavery is not the dominant labor system. Systems of family labor, systems of indentured servitude, systems of wage labor compete with slavery. Slavery is just one of many forms of labor. Slave societies, on the other hand, are systems in which slavery, being the dominant form of labor, shapes every other social relationship in that society. A relationship between men and women, relationships between parent and children, relationships between husbands and wives, relationships between workers and bosses, relationships between rulers and rules. Slavery is the institution which gives all of them form. So if we think about
Let's put those two definitions on your screen now. A society with slaves is a society in which slavery exists, but is not the only and dominant labor system. Other labor systems such as indentured servitude and family labor also exist. This is in contrast with a slave society, in which slavery is the dominant form of labor and shapes every other society. Based on these definitions, Rome was a slave society. In Roman Italy, although not the entire Roman Empire, slave labor produced most of the income of the wealthy by laboring on their farms and estates. Thus, while slavery was only one form of dependent labor, the labor of slaves was critical for the elite. They served their owners as servants, administrators, financial agents, and secretaries. Thus, elite wealth, status, and leisure were all built on the labor and lives of enslaved people. As an expression of power, even a model of domination, slavery had an importance beyond its economic significance. Slavery shaped the Roman mentality. Because slavery was considered degrading, Roman satirists, poets, philosophers, and historians could label an individual or behavior servile when they wanted to denigrate someone or some act. The institution of slavery also helped shape other relationships. In a cum manu marriage, a man literally took possession over his wife. As already mentioned, a man could sell his family members into slavery as easily as he could sell a slave. And the force a man was allowed to use against his son is very similar to the force he could use against a slave. The story of Cicero and his brother joking about flogging with the freedman Tiro from your Joshua reading shows how the institution of slavery always defined the lives of freed persons. Their master had freed them, and therefore they could refer to their former status frequently. And since freed persons became the clients of their former enslavers, this idea of dominance has also influenced the relationship between client and patron. And finally, slavery became a useful metaphor for the lives of senators who felt disempowered by the rule of the emperors, especially bad emperors. However, there are 4 sources that are invaluable to us when it comes to talking about slavery. The first is literature. Even when invented, legendary, rumor, invective, insults, what have you, these texts make assumptions that tell us about Roman social life. Even where the story and the characters are fictional, they depict Roman attitudes, values, and ways of seeing. Law refers to the social world and hence to Roman slave society. Law describes the position of freeborn citizens, slaves, and freed men. In many ways, law articulates the honor of individuals with respect to others and the state, drawing clear connections between honor and power. However, if we rely solely on literature and law, we leave out the experiences of the enslaved people themselves and the lower classes. While they describe the social reality, literature and law do not represent the non-privileged groups of Rome. They may speak about enslaved people and ex-enslaved people, but they do so from the perspective of slaveholders and freeborn Romans. We begin to fill this gap with inscriptions. Romans of all classes inscribed a wide variety of texts on stone, and some of these inscriptions record the actions of men and women whose experience is excluded from law and literature. One good example of this is epitaphs. Although they belong to the world of the dead, they refer to a lived social reality, and the epitaph made the dead present for the living. The only problem is that they offer the barest facts. Historians can color in the outlines by paying careful attention to the authorship of epitaphs, their context, and their audiences, as well as by drawing on legal and literary sources for information. That leaves us with archaeology. Many material remains beyond inscriptions have been preserved. We've seen plenty of them. However, included among the sexual imagery and religious imagery and buildings were images of war captives, slaves and ex-slaves, representations of work, and even fetters used to restrain captives. The perspectives of these four kinds of sources tell us a great deal about Roman slavery. The literary and legal sources illustrate the institutional nature of the slaveholder's power and speak to the centrality of enslaved individuals in creating cultural niceties. The epitaph, even in its relative muteness, offers hints about an enslaved person's views. And the archaeological site helps us to appreciate the space of a slave's everyday life. However, within all of this, it is very important to note that there are absolutely no sources written by an enslaved individual about their lived experience beyond a few graffiti. This is another aspect of the institution of slavery, as it shows the dominance of enslavers over those they enslave. They get to shape the narrative.